it's true that, and in fact, I will start from that point. Then in October 2014, we had celebrated the 10th anniversary since the Palermo Forum that I organized when I was chief statistician of the OECD. And looking back, indeed, that forum was the starting point of a process that today we can say the world has recognized as vital. Yes, I was quite ambitious at the time, it's true, but I would like to share with you that a few weeks ago when I received the UN Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon's synthesis report, which is the basis of the negotiations that will start in a few days to agree, we hope, on a universal agenda at the world level in September 2015, I saw two key ingredients in this report. The first was our recommendations of the advisory group that Conchita mentioned that I chaired a few months ago. And the second one is this sentence, which confirms what the Future We Want declaration of the Rio +20 in 2012 was already saying, that work on developing alternative measures of progress beyond GDP must receive the dedicated attention of the United Nations international financial institutions, scientific community, and public institutions. And the wording that is using is measuring social progress, human well-being, justice, security, equality, and sustainability are really the keywords that movement Sergio was alluding to brought to the attention of the world. But also, as you can see, a very interesting reference to the multidimensional nature of poverty. There is a stream of work developed especially at the Oxford University and around the world on multidimensional poverty. And finally, even subjective well-being, the happiness, took some place here in this paper. So you could say that actually over the last 10 years, a lot of things happened. And this is really a very brief summary since the forum in Palermo. In 2005, I established the Global Project on Measuring the Progress of Societies. The big success was the Second World Forum in 2007 with the Istanbul Declaration. I will make a reference to that. A few months later, and before the European Conference Beyond GDP, I was invited to give a couple of speeches to the advisors to Madame Lagarde, that at the time was the French Minister of Finance, and I launched the idea of establishing a commission that then became the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission. The real moment in which the world has discovered this movement was mid-2009. In August, the European Commission communication on GDP and beyond, by the way, they discussed for 3 months the title. There were some people who were saying beyond GDP, but the ECFIN was saying, no, this is not acceptable. So they finally decided GDP and beyond. And then the September 2009, we published our framework on equitable and sustainable well-being, the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report. The French government took to the G20 conference in Pittsburgh, I think, a reference to that. In October 2009, the third OECD World Forum was organized, and the OECD established a roadmap that led then to the OECD Better Life Initiative and Better Life Index, and then the fourth OECD World Forum in 2012 in India. And finally, I would say, as Europe is not being lazy on this, the European Commission staff paper on the work done by European Statistical System that was published in August 2013. I was also very proud by the fact that after I left the OECD in 2009, August 2009, to become president of the Italian Statistical Office, the OECD has taken this agenda forward very strongly, up to the point that they also changed the motto of the organization from for a better world economy to better policies for better lives. And if you attended any meeting at the new conference center of the OECD in Paris, you have references to Better Life Index, well-being everywhere. So it's true that the OECD really embraced this agenda very strongly, not only on the measurement side, but also from the policy side. And in fact, my lecture today will be divided in two parts. The first part will be mainly about the statistical processes, hoping that Luxembourg and other countries want to do, for example, what we did in Italy. But the second point will be about the policy side and the political economy of this process, which is quite challenging. Before entering into that, let me just spend a few minutes about the theoretical background, not of the well-being, but the role of statistics and indicators in shaping up a society. Amartya Sen always said, talking about indicators is just a way to decide where do we want to go. And in particular, talking about indicators focuses the attention of the media, of the society, of the economy, and the government, and so on, everyone, on what we want to achieve. This is the role of data and indicators. And if you look at the literature on the functioning of a democracy, in particular looking at the models that apply the economic game theory to democratic games, and also the political sciences literature, all this literature indicates that the game of a democracy would be much better if citizens could observe through indicators the state of the art, and in particular the impact of policies. Because through this observation, they could better select the politicians. So this is why the word statistics comes from science of the state. This, of course, could be the state of the world, but also the state as an institution. And this is why, for years now, I talked about, instead of statistique, of sociistic. Something that today is so pervasive in our society that you really cannot imagine a society today without data and statistics. The point is that we human beings focus very much on what we measure, and we measure what we value. Therefore, if we decide to measure something, our attention is focused on that instead of something else. This is why it's so important to understand the role of statistics in the modern societies. And a few years ago I asked myself why I saw so many papers trying to measure the value added of everything but statistics. Have you ever seen a paper made by a statistician trying to measure the value added of statistics? So I started thinking about this, and so I went to the International Classification of Economic Activities, and I found that statistics is classified under the general government, general services and defense, and in particular economic planning and statistics. So producing statistics is a service. Therefore, what is the value of a service? Or where the value of a service does come from? According to the system of national accounts, the value of a service depends on the change that it produces in the consumer. So what kind of change should the consumption of statistics produce in a consumer? And my answer is knowledge. You don't know anything about a particular phenomenon, you look at statistics and you get an idea. Then you merge that information with other informations you have and you make your own decisions. This is why I put together this formula of the production, the value of the production of statistics, which depends on the quantity of statistics which is produced, then the role of media to bring these statistics to people, and this is the supply side, and then the demand side, which is specific for every single consumer, depends on the relevance of data, on the trust you have on the source of the data, and finally on your capacity of using those data to develop knowledge. But it's enough that one of these ingredients is zero, that the production of statistics has a zero value. So you see that the chain, the production chain of statistics is much longer than what we normally think. And this is why during my time at the OECD with this process, this project, but also at Italian Statistical Office, I tried to invest also a lot on the dissemination of information to normal citizens, literacy, statistical literacy, and so on and so forth. All these ingredients are necessary to allow those game theory models applied to democracy to work. Because if people are not able to use statistics to make politicians accountable, the game doesn't work. If the data that we use are not relevant for making the right decisions, the game doesn't work, and so on and so forth. So I wanted just to give you this conceptual background that led me over the years to push this agenda towards the results that we have seen. Just some references. This is just also to keep you awake. I didn't write who said that, so it's up to you to guess. The first one is a sentence. We have used the GDP to determine wrongfully what is in fact the state of well-being of a country. So it's a paradigm shift that we need to make, because we have both the needs of the body and the needs of the mind. And so what we have focused on was mainly the body, the heart. Who do you think said that? It's the former Prime Minister of Bhutan. You know that Bhutan is famous for developing the happiness indicator? And in a conference in Istanbul, he said that. He also said, you statisticians, you economists, as I'm an economist working in statistics, I got two smashes in a sense. You destroyed the world when you invented the GDP, but now you have the opportunity to rescue the world if you do something else. Second sentence, we have a very different measure of what constitutes progress in this country. We measure progress on how many people can find a job that pays the mortgage, whether you can put a little extra money away at the end of each month, so you can someday watch your child receive her college diploma, not by the number of billionaires we have or the profits of the Fortune 500. Do you have an idea who said that? Barack Obama, when he accepted the nomination to run for the Democratic Party. So you see that Washington and Thimphu is the capital of Bhutan are not very far from each other. And the third one, many people looked at the US GDP growth in the year 2000s and said, how fast you are growing. By the way, the OECD had established its publication Going for Growth, exactly using the US as a model. We must imitate you, but it was not sustainable or equitable growth. Even before the crash, most people were worse off than they were in year 2000. It was a decade of decline for most Americans. Joe Stiglitz. But the point that Joe is making is the following. If instead of looking at GDP per capita, we looked at the median GDP, we would have never chosen US as a model. This is a big story. And you can understand how dangerous could be to choose the right or the wrong indicator. This is the point that I want to make. The Istanbul Declaration that we signed in 2007 was calling statistical offices, public and private organizations and academic experts to go beyond GDP and to encourage communities to consider what progress meant to them, share best practices, stimulate international debate, advocate appropriate investment in building statistical capacity. This was done in 2007. And in 2007, we already hoped to be able to influence the post-2015 agenda as we did with the declaration that I mentioned to you by Ban Ki-moon. That was the dream. When Sarkozy established the commission, the Stiglitz and Fitoussi Commission, several people said, this is the usual game of diverting attention from something that you as politicians cannot provide anymore, growth, to something else. So you will not be judged on what you cannot do, but you will try to focus on happiness. Yeah, I don't think that this was the reason, but these are the most recent forecasts by the OECD for the next 50 years. I think that we have to understand that unlimited growth is not happening anymore. Or at least is likely not happening, let me put it this way. And in particular for the advanced economies, according to the OECD, we will go, in the best case, towards 2% GDP growth per year. Not more than that. Of course, this is an average and so on. And with this kind of growth, it will be very difficult to absorb unemployment, to manage migration towards developed countries, and so on and so forth. But more than that, according to their estimates, there will be an increasing inequality in this process. And why would be that? Because according to the normal economic paradigm, for developed countries, the only way to try to raise their GDP growth will be to push down costs, and in particular salaries. And this will lead to unacceptable inequalities. This is what the OECD is saying. And in fact, The Guardian, commenting on this paper, they published an article with the title, "The capitalism has already given its best for developed countries and will do it for developing countries by 2030. What's next?" Because the OECD paper didn't give us the name of the murder. So what is the solution? Do we have a solution? Do we have a plan B or plan C and so on? Do we know how to manage a democracy that doesn't grow? Capitalism is based on the idea that the future will be better than the current situation. So if you are poor, there is a hope for you. Or maybe not for you, but for your child. Not for your child, but for your nephew. But anyway, one day someone from your family will be better. If this is not what people think, and in Europe, as you will see later, is not the case, how do you manage democracy in this way? This is the real question, a very serious question. In 2009, we developed at the OECD a framework on how to measure progress. By the way, we revamped this word, progress, that was used by philosophers since the Greek time, and it was almost forbidden after the Second World War because both communism and Nazi-fascism had used this word as the necessary tendency towards the future. So and nobody was using this word anymore. This is why we tried to revamp it, but we said the progress of societies, recognizing that each society may have a different vision of what progress means. So the idea was that we have to focus mainly on two systems. One is the human system, the other is the ecosystem. There are relationships between the two. And what we should focus on is the human well-being and the ecosystem conditions. In this perspective, culture, governance, economy are means to an end, not the final end. Of course, they are very important. When the recession started, a friend from the Italian Business Association told me, now we'll see whether with the decline of GDP people will be happier. And Italy is a great case of unhappy, let's say, degrowth. So the OECD framework at the time identified these different dimensions of well-being. The ecosystem condition, the human well-being, and then two cross-cutting dimensions, which is about inequality. The first one is inequality within the current generation. The second one is inequality across generations, is the sustainability issue. A lot of people are talking now about inequality of this generation. Piketty and others are pushing in this direction. Everybody recognizes that sustainability is very important. But then at the end, we do what Woody Allen proposed, reusing Groucho Marx sentence. Why should I care about a future generation? What did they do for me? Well, this is exactly why we have destroyed our environment and so on and so forth. Because we didn't care. It's not easy to care. In a discussion we had in Davos a few years ago, in a session on this, a former Minister of Environment from UK said, I am convinced that the climate change is a big problem. But if I go to see my fellow ministers and I say, let's slow down GDP growth in order to avoid this, first they would be laughing and then I will not be re-elected. So there is no way for me, unless, he said, you statisticians developed indicators of risks. So when I go for the next election, I can show that GDP growth maybe was a little bit lower than what it could have been, but I reduced the risk of losing everything. But we do not have this kind of risk indicators. So we continue to drive like a blind in a night, which doesn't make a big difference, of course, for a blind person. That is where we are today. And so we defined the progress of a society as an increase in what we called equitable and sustainable well-being. The OECD, after I left, developed the OECD well-being conceptual framework, thanks to which they developed this Better Life Index and a lot of measures that have been very successful. All these elements with the red arrow were already included in our 2009 framework. So it's differently framed, it's differently presented, but it's very close to what we had developed in 2009. Except for one element, which is the green one, the subjective well-being. If you believe in the Bentham philosophy, you would say that subjective well-being is the only thing that matters. Richard Layard and others said all these discussions can be summarized by asking people, how do you feel? Are you happy? Are you satisfied with your health, with your life, and so on? So for years, we couldn't really find a place for this because we didn't want to just throw out the rest. So we tended also in Italy, as we will see in a second, to add the subjective well-being to the other dimensions, knowing that the subjective well-being depends on health, work-life balance, education and skill, and so on and so forth. So how can we reconcile this subjective and the objective dimension? The idea that came to my mind was the following one. I draw in sand in Bhutan, by the way, in a meeting, during a meeting of an international working group at the beginning of January 2013, that was put together by the king of Bhutan and the government to advise the UN on a new economic development. What is the point here? Normally we start with the human needs, then we build our society to produce GDP. This is a very, I would say, crude way of presenting it. But this is the old style. Then we decided that we have human needs, we have our society and the economy, and we recognize that we draw from different forms of capital. Human capital, social capital, natural capital, economic capital, like in the OECD framework. To produce what? To produce what we call equitable and sustainable well-being, which means the health and so on and so forth. And then we have a problem with happiness. And we try to add, as I said, happiness to the other dimensions. What came to my mind is that the relationship between these outcomes and happiness is not an additive one, it's a multiplicative one. During that conference, someone said that a guy said that after 15 years of being in prison, he said that was the happiest period of my life, because I didn't have any education, I had the possibility of studying, and now I'm a writer. So I realized my dream. So what links what we have, even a prison, well, what we get in terms of happiness depends on what I called happiness skills. Our capacity of transforming what we have into happiness. So it's a multiplication, it's not, you see, it's not something that is add. But why is this relevant? Because now, through the behavioral economics and neurosciences, we know that happier people work differently, have a better health, have interpersonal relations, and the society works better. It's not only because we should be interested in individuals' happiness, but because it's a sort of positive externality for the economy, for the society, and even for the needs. Because if we are happy and we understand that we are not alone, we have to incorporate the needs of the environment, for example, in our model. And the other good news, and this arrow from the development paradigm to happiness skills, is that now positive psychology and neuroscience can demonstrate that we can teach how to be happy. Not how to be happy, how to develop your happiness skills, which is about being resilient, for example. When you have a shock, you can get depressed, or you can try to react. This is part of the happiness skills. And is exactly what Europe is discussing when we believe that through certain reforms, we can stimulate people to react positively. But if they are depressed, they don't work. So in this way, this model has a feedback loop that is important. Now, let me go quickly now towards the end, the second part, with Italian BES, benessere equo e sostenibile, equitable and sustainable well-being process. I launched that when I was president of the Italian Statistical Office, and this led now to reports every 2 years, and the process that we established was the following. We started with a survey, statistical survey, on what matters to people. Then a steering committee agreed on the main domains of well-being. Then there was a scientific commission that worked for several months to try to identify the best possible indicators for each domain, and then finally, through an iteration, this was used to develop the model. Interesting, the results of what people, Italians, think make their well-being. Good health, nice. Guarantee the future of your children socially and economically. This was really unexpected. This is the intertemporal dimension, which is very strong in Italian culture, of course, even a little bit too strong, because then the families do the welfare system that doesn't necessarily help young people to be resilient, let me put it this way. And then you can see the other stuff there. So we ended with these 12 domains. 8 are relevant for the individual sphere, and 4 are relevant for the context. But also in these cases, you can see we added the subjective well-being to the others. This was done before the illumination in Bhutan. On top of this program, at national level, we started also a program at local level. The 15 major Italian cities joined the Eurobus project in order to make all these indicators available also at local level. I was able to put in the legislation on digital agenda the fact that through the smart cities projects we should evaluate the well-being of citizens at city level. This year, last year, the economic and financial document by the Italian government included the BES as a relevant framework and proposed to use it to make the impact assessment of reforms. Of course, the Statistical Office is working hard on sustainability, resilience, and the use of composite indicators. And now some regions, Tuscany is the first, decided to use the BES as the reference model for this strategic planning. What are the lessons learned? First, that in order to have really support for this kind of projects, you need to have a broad discussion with different actors. You need to stimulate interest at local level because it's where people live, where communities can develop this sense of collective well-being. It's a very important tool to strengthen the position of the National Statistical Institute vis-à-vis users. It's quite a complicated process. You have only one shot to use, because if something goes wrong, it's very complicated to have the credibility to do it again. And evidence-based decision-making is the real challenge. So it's the transformation of this data into politics that is the real challenge. Just a reference to the international measurement agenda that is followed by the OECD, Eurostat, UNDP, and several initiatives. By the way, I was invited in September at the German Chancellery to advise them on their project on quality of life, which is part of the Großkoalition Pact that they have signed. So they are finally starting this process, but as usual, when Germany starts, they do it very squared, in a very squared way, and we will see what they will be doing. Now, let's suppose that you have done this. Do you really believe that this changed the perspective from which you look at the world? This is an official European Commission publication. The continuous line is the disposable income for households in the euro area, in real terms. The dotted line is the GDP. Well, first of all, you should ask yourself, where do the 4 points that you have at the peak in the first quarter of 2008, where did they go? Not to families, not to households. Where did that money go? And you easily answer multinationals, profits of multinational based outside Europe, remittances of migrants, and so on and so forth. So having a GDP growth doesn't necessarily mean that your citizens get the GDP, first. Second, big crisis. I would say that households, thanks to automatic stabilizers, didn't realize a big crisis in the first part. But then they didn't realize also they didn't get anything from the recovery. And then when the GDP, as you can see, was again declining down, and the condition of households was much worse. These data are available at quarterly level on the Eurostat website. Have you seen anyone using it in the public debate? Have you seen any media reporting on this? So it makes a change. This is a chart from the subjective well-being and the crisis. You have life satisfaction, black line, and experience stress yesterday. This is the difference between life satisfaction and affective happiness, the way in which you feel now. If I ask you, are you happy now? It depends on how well I'm talking, how well you ate, and so on and so forth. While if I ask you, are you satisfied with your life? You wouldn't think about the current moment. You would think about your expectations, what you have done would be a different. Well, these charts are describing these two dynamics, in a sense, for the euro area, for the United States, for Japan, and so on. Expectations of subjective well-being, a comparison between the expectation in 2005 and 2012 about the current satisfaction and your future expected satisfaction. Pessimism is so diffuse now in our societies. And then you ask yourself, why is the Italian government putting 10 billion euros in giving 80 euros per household, middle income households, hoping that consumption would have boosted, and nothing happened? Because people are scared and they tend to save money. Enterprises don't want to invest in a so black future. So you see how the subjective dimension is relevant also for macroeconomic tendencies. Trust. Our politicians promise growth always the next year. You know the famous wish next year in Jerusalem that the Jewish were saying for a lot of time, let me put it this way. And every time they promise growth and it doesn't happen, trust goes down. And this is a real issue. This is the Sarkozy's point that I was making before. Of course, without growth, we don't know how to manage a sustainable society. But with too high growth, not a green growth, we don't know how to make it sustainable from an environmental point of view. And we are still squeezed between these two dimensions. This is a very interesting book, How Was Life by the OECD, a review of the last 180 years of data on well-being. Very interesting. And these are the correlations between GDP growth and the other ingredients. Look at the inequality, which is this one. And until some years ago, let's say Second World War, the increase in GDP was associated to a reduction of inequality. It's not like this anymore. Serge made a reference to a recent study by the OECD on inequality and growth, and this is the type of result that they have found, that the impact of inequality was to depress growth in almost all countries over the last decade. And in fact, this is also a very interesting chart about the top 1% in terms of income, But we know very well that inequality is not only inequality in terms of income and wealth, but is also inequality in access to education and many other elements of well-being, and they are closely linked. We know now that there is a scarring effect for people who come from poor families, because it's very likely that they will create another poor family during their life. This is a quite impressive chart from the same report. It's about the components of the top 0.1% of income share in the United States. And the bottom curve is the income, the salary side. All the rest is linked to capital income, capital gains, and so on. And of course, this is a very cumulative process. Now, let me come to the last point. This is a fantastic EU treaty that we have. Have you ever read it, Article 3? I'm proud of being European when I read this. The Union aim is to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its peoples. The Union shall establish an internal market. It shall work for the sustainable development, balanced economic growth, price stability, social market economy, highly competitive, aiming at full employment and social progress, high level of protection, improvement of the quality of environment. It shall combat social exclusion and discrimination, promote social justice and protection, rights of the child, promote economic, social and territorial cohesion and solidarity among member states. The problem is that the other articles of the treaty say, well, part of this story, the economic side, is managed at a European level, and the social one is your problem. Okay, let's believe that our policies should just implement what the treaty says, which is what the Equitable and Sustainable Well-being Framework is talking about. How can you do that? When I finished my period as a minister, I think I was the only minister who put on the website a paper describing all the initiatives that we had taken in my field of competence, of course. And then what I tried to do was to try to assess the expected impact of those actions on the best indicators as far as labor and poverty are concerned. So this is very qualitative process done ex post. Green is the expected impact of all actions we made during 10 months in terms of economic and in social and labor market. Red is that is expected to produce a negative dimension. And on the column you have the different indicators of BES. This was done during, let's say, a weekend, just a qualitative assessment. But we could try to do something like this more seriously, using models, using analytics. So what are the main obstacles to do that? A recent report made by the Brain Pool project at European level identify these seven potential obstacles that prevent to move the Beyond GDP agenda from the statistical side to the political side. And there are serious concerns. One of them is very important, that we have the ministries and the Commission organized in silos according to an old framework, but we should try to rearrange the way in which our governments work. Two other reports were published recently in UK, well-being on policy and the well-being in 4 policy areas. And the recommendations that came from the second report are the following. First of all, that all UK parties and the governments should set out a well-being strategy, including objectives and how it intends to achieve them, the use of well-being-based policy assessment, the incorporation of well-being assessment into budget allocations, and tools to facilitate the cross-departmental work needed to increase the well-being benefits of policy. UK is seriously doing this kind of work. And you can find a lot of information about what they are doing. I would say that in Europe, not only Europe, they are the most advanced government that is trying to take this seriously. Now, good news to conclude. There are opportunities for the European Union. The European Commission has been just nominated, and they are looking for a new narrative for the future of the EU. They try to reorganize their work with this matrix approach. Very nice in theory, very complicated to implement, but there could be a possibility to use this more integrated approach to improve sectoral policies using the equitable and sustainable well-being as a framework. The new parliament could play a role, for example, establishing a well-being committee that could review the sectoral policies and push the Commission to have a more comprehensive. Then by next week, the mid-2015, the European institutions have to revamp the Europe 2020 or 2030 at this point agenda. And it's possible to try to merge this with the Sustainable Development Goals that will be adopted at a global level. So it's a great opportunity to rebuild the medium-term framework of our policies. And the so-called European semesters could be improved, for example, bringing other dimensions into what they are doing now. And finally, the European Commission is updating the framework for the impact assessment of new legislation. The proposal has all the ingredients of a well-being framework. This could be the way to proceed. And very finally, the new European Political Strategy Center, the former BEPA, that was established by the President of the Commission, could develop this more integrated policy approach and eventually push the services of the Commission to develop better analytical tools to assess policies. Now, you could say, Professor Giovannini, have you heard about the crisis? What are you talking about? Are you serious? In such a spirit of my part and on yours, we face our common difficulties. They concern, thanks God, only material things. Values have shrunken to fantastic levels. Our ability to pay has fallen. The means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade. The savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence. The people of this country have been erroneously encouraged to believe that they could keep on increasing the output indefinitely, and that some magician would find ways and means for that increased output to be consumed with reasonable profit to the producer. Without regard to party, the overwhelming majority of our people seek a greater opportunity for humanity to prosper and find happiness. They recognize that human welfare has not increased and does not increase through mere materialism and luxury, but that it does progress through integrity, unselfishness, responsibility and justice. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the midst of the worst crisis of the United States. Can't we say the same now? So I conclude with another text from the UN Secretary General's synthesis report, which describes our troubled world, and Europe is indeed in trouble. And it concludes saying that if the global community does not exercise national and international leadership in the service of our peoples, we risk further fragmentation, impunity and strife, endangering both the planet itself as well as the future of peace, sustainable development and respect of human rights. Simply put, this generation is charged with the duty to transform our societies. Thank you very much.